2 million people set out for the same exact destination, but only 2 people made it. Let me give you a little context first. The Israelites were God's chosen people. For over 400 years, they lived as slaves in Egypt under harsh oppression. They were forced into hard labor, mistreated, and they had very little control over their own lives. Then, God raised up Moses to deliver them. Through miraculous signs and the parting of the Red Sea, God rescued them from slavery and began leading them towards the Promised Land, a land He had promised to Abraham generations earlier. See, this journey should have only taken them a few weeks. Instead, it lasted 40 years. Because an entire generation refused to trust God, only 2 people made it to the Promised Land. And when you start reading through Exodus and Numbers, you start to realize something that's quite impossible to miss. The Israelites didn't have a wilderness problem. It wasn't because they lacked strength or opportunity. See, the greatest thing standing between them and God's promise wasn't the wilderness or enemy armies. It was their mind. And that's why today I want to show you 2 mental patterns that kept the Israelites from entering the Promised Land. Because the most unsettling part is they're the same patterns that are keeping us stuck this very day. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Mind and Bible, where we let God transform us by changing the way we think. Okay, so let's begin with the first mental behavior, mental barriers. One of the greatest misconceptions about the Israelites is that just because they left Egypt, they also left their slavery behind, because they didn't. They walked out of Egypt one night, but Egypt never walked out of them. So basically, their chains were gone, but their thinking remained the same. Because for over 400 years, they remained under oppression. That generation after generation, they learned what it meant to be powerless, what it meant to be oppressed, what it meant to be overlooked and controlled. Eventually, these experiences became more than just memories. It started to become the lens in which they interpreted life. Psychologically, we would describe these as being deeply rooted schemas or mental frameworks. They are beliefs that we develop through repeated experiences, and these repeated experiences shape the way we see ourselves, the way we see reality, and the way we see other people. That means you can leave one season of life while mentally continuing to live there. So for instance, you can leave an abusive home, but still believe you're worthless. You can leave addiction, but still believe you'll never change. You can leave financial hardship, but still believe you'll never have enough. And you can still become a Christian while still continuing to carry beliefs that you had way before you met Christ. And so that's what happens. The Israelites kept defining themselves by who they used to be. And when you define yourself by captivity, it's very difficult to walk confidently into a future of freedom. Okay, but so why did they continue seeing the world through the lens of slavery after God had already delivered them? That brings us to our second mental behavior. Mental behavior number 2, trauma response. So the Israelites carried something much deeper than just bad habits. They carried generations of trauma. Psychologists have observed that people who live under prolonged oppression often begin expecting danger. They expect disappointment and suffering, no matter where they go. So over time, the mind becomes conditioned to assume that when something goes wrong, something bad is going to happen right after. And sometimes this way of thinking is referred to as siege mentality. And siege mentality means that a group of people believe that they are against the entire world, that the world is trying to harm or defeat them, or that they continuously have negative behavioral intentions towards them. And so the Israelites began interpreting every single setback as an attack towards them. I mean, they endured a lot of generational trauma, enslavement, isolation, and there was a lot of mistrust and suspicion. And despite God's goodness to them, they could not see past their struggles. Although God was preparing them for something new, they were refusing to accept that. Every obstacle became proof that God had abandoned them, and every delay became evidence that there was something wrong. Okay, so notice something important here. Their circumstances had changed, but their interpretation did not. So when they reached the wilderness, after everything they had seen God do, their minds didn't say, God's preparing us. Instead, their minds thought, God brought us here to die. It was a way of thinking that had been rehearsed for generations. Trauma doesn't just change because of a location change. When you heal, that requires learning to think differently. So because of these mental barriers, it produced a behavior. Because we try to find comfort in a situation because of our past trauma, it produces a coping mechanism. So because of prolonged stress and trauma and isolation, our brains will then start to develop a way to cope with all of that. And for the Israelites, that's when comfort became a coping mechanism. We read in Exodus 32, starting in verse 1, when the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. Come on, they said, and make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses, who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So Aaron said, take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me. And all the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought us out of the land of Egypt." So Moses had just gone up to Mount Sinai to get further instruction from the Lord, but he was gone 40 days and 40 nights. But because Moses was gone longer than expected, uncertainty for them became uncomfortable for their mind. Psychologically, our brains crave predictability because predictability feels safe. When uncertainty increases, we begin searching for something that's familiar because that familiar feeling reduces our anxiety. So the Israelites didn't return to idolatry because it was just better. They returned because it was familiar. They needed something that was tangible, that was visible to them. Something that they could see and go, okay, I know this is familiar. And unfortunately, things that are harmful but are familiar to us are often safer than freedom. Like for instance, has God ever freed you from something, but a part of you still goes back to it? Like a toxic relationship, an abusive marriage, financial debt, or even some form of addiction. Sometimes that's not just because you want pain, it's because your mind is trying to return to what's familiar. And that's where the coping mechanisms come into play, because psychologically, when we experience prolonged stress, prolonged isolation, instability, or trauma, our brains start to develop coping mechanisms to help us survive. So in other words, the brain will choose short-term relief over long-term healing. So that's why when life becomes uncertain, the mind drifts back into its old way of thinking and its old patterns, old habits. Not necessarily because you missed the pain, but you just crave what's comfortable. So we move into the second and final behavior that kept these Israelites, over 2 million people, stuck, and that is grumbling. Complaining isn't something we say, it's something that's rehearsed. So what I mean by that is the more that we complain, the more our minds become trained to notice everything that's wrong. And psychology teaches that whatever we repeatedly rehearse, it becomes easier to think over time. And this is called confirmation bias because our brains will start to confirm what we already believe. It'll confirm the story that we've been telling ourselves. And so the Israelites stopped noticing the manna. They stopped remembering the Red Sea. They stopped celebrating God's faithfulness. And their minds had become so focused on what they lacked, they could no longer recognize what God had already provided for them. Complaining became the lens in which they saw reality. And I think this is something that we see in everyday lives. Like we complain because we're not where we hoped we'd be by now. We complain because life isn't moving as expected or as we think it should be. We complain because someone else is further ahead than where we are or where we would like to be. And because of this, sometimes instead of dealing with our own disappointments, we begin focusing in on someone else's shortcomings. And people do this as a way to protect themselves from difficult emotions. If I can convince myself that someone else's life is way worse than mine, way more dysfunctional than mine, even just a little bit, even if I cook and clean and someone else, they don't cook and clean, especially not as well as I do, then that tells your mind that I am definitely a better person than them. And momentarily, you start to feel better about your situation. But notice you haven't actually dealt with your disappointment. You've just redirected your attention. So complaining can become a coping mechanism that distracts us from what's actually going on in our own hearts. And before long, our minds become experts at finding what's missing instead of recognizing what God is doing. So we've gone through the behaviors and the mental barriers that the Israelites face. And those same mental barriers and behaviors are things that go on inside the minds of you and I, even to this day. So how do we change this? How do we fix this from it ruining our destiny, our purpose, so that way we enter into our promised land, so to speak, so that way we don't miss the blessing that God has for our lives? That comes to our last point, which is we renew the mind with gratitude. How do we break this mental pattern that's been going on for years and for generations? Well, Paul gives us the answer in Philippians 2:14. He says, "Do everything without complaining or arguing." Stay with me, because I know this verse can trip up a lot of people, because your situation can be so destructive. So it can be so hard to get out. You think, you don't know my situation. You don't know what I've been through or what I'm currently going through. Paul gets it. He understands where you're at. And remember, Paul wrote these very words from prison. Paul wasn't in his finest clothes on a balcony overlooking this great scenery. He was suffering himself. And he understood that complaining doesn't just affect our words, it shapes our minds. The consistent pattern of complaining, it triggers your stress hormone, and prolonged exposure to that stress hormone impacts your memory and your emotional regulation. So it's putting your nervous system on high alert constantly when you complain. So complaining isn't just words, it's actually affecting the way we process information, the way we retain information, and it affects our body and our nervous system. Our entire being goes with it. Okay, so if we stop complaining, then what should we replace it with? Glad you asked. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." In is our key word, in all circumstances, and he does not say for all circumstances. He is not telling us that every single hardship is good, and you need to be thankful for that hardship. He's teaching us to recognize God's goodness even in the middle of that hardship. This is where we should be praising God instead of grumbling in our hearts towards God. And on a side note, it's okay to bring your concerns and your stresses and your doubts and your worries and even your frustrations to God. But it's not okay to let that simmer in your heart and in your spirit to the point where you're grumbling, you're complaining day in, day out. No, it doesn't matter if God answers your prayer or not. You're never content. And that's the trap where a lot of us fall in. And unfortunately, that's the trap that the Israelites fell in as well. Complaining is rehearsing your problems. Gratitude is rehearsing God's faithfulness. One trains your mind for what's wrong, and the other trains your mind to recognize what God is doing. 2 million people stood at the edge of God's promise, and only 2 made it. Not because they were stronger, not because they were more gifted, but because they chose to trust God while everyone else continued rehearsing their fear. So this leads us to ask, what mindset am I carrying into the place that God is leading me? And remember, it says in the Bible, "Behold, I am creating something new." And it says every single morning, God's mercies are new. So every single morning you have a chance to wake up to a new beginning. The great thing about God is that he gives you an opportunity to rewrite your history, to walk into a brand new life of freedom. Thank you guys so much for watching. If any part of this video has encouraged you or challenged the way you think, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear it. Please like this video if you like this type of content, and please subscribe, because I do post content on how to renew your minds and what the Bible says about our minds and how it affects our every single day life every week. And I will see you guys next week. Until then, keep letting God transform you by changing the way you think.